When I learned that I'd be giving a TED Talk on what makes things funny, I went and asked my friends what makes them laugh. I got a really interesting range of responses. Ale told me the website 9gag is humorous to her. My friend Rob sent me a picture of a building that looks like a chicken. Nushin laughed at this not very welcoming welcome mat. Kim thinks dogs riding on skateboards are funny. Laura is amused by puns and wordplay. My friend Jerry sent me a picture of David Bartolet from the Bocconi website. My cousin Eric laughed at this newspaper article about a couple who self-administer enemas using coffee. My favorite response came from Josh. Josh drew me a diagram of a man entering a porta potty, and then the porta potty is then catapulted into the air. So if you don't see the humor, or at least the disgust here, think about what happens once the gravity kicks in. I also thought about how people who didn't have the opportunity to respond to my question, what they laugh at. So in medieval times, kings used to laugh at jesters who they would hire to behave like fools. Germans laugh at other people's misery. Babies laugh when playing peekaboo. And a number of species, humans, apes, possibly even rats, laugh when tickled. So what I'm going to try to do today is explain how all of these things that seem so different can produce a similar response of laughter and amusement. In other words, what makes all of these things, as well as other things, humorous? A related question I want to answer is how come perceptions of humor differ so dramatically between people? How can the same thing that seems funny to one person seem offensive to a second person and boring to a third? Answering these questions is important because humor is a large part of our everyday lives. Humor influences, it helps us interact with coworkers, build relationships, and influences who we decide to date. Humor also has many benefits. It entertains us, keeps us happy, and can even help us cope with loss and tragedy. So there are a lot of really good reasons for understanding humor and studying humor. My reasons are actually much less noble. I started studying humor when I was reading a moral psychology paper. And this paper by a psychologist named Jonathan Haidt argued that people's moral judgments, so what they think is wrong, are heavily influenced by negative feelings, especially disgust. So what Haidt did was he created a number of scenarios that he used in experiments to illustrate his point. Let me give you an example. In one of his scenarios, a man goes to the supermarket and buys a dead chicken. But before cooking the chicken, he has sexual intercourse with it. Then he cooks the chicken and eats it. So like many of you, I was disgusted by this event, by this story. As Haidt predicted, I also thought, yes, that behavior is wrong, but at the same time, I was laughing. I wanted to find out why something that was so wrong could seem so funny, at least to me. So I teamed up with Peter McGraw, a professor at the University of Colorado, who had encountered a similar question when presenting his research on taboo trade-offs. And we set off to answer the question of what makes moral violations, or things that people consider wrong, funny. This was a really fun project. We got to run all kinds of crazy experiments involving behaviors like a woman who steals all the tips at her daughter's wedding, a man who snorts his dead father's ashes, a girl who auctions off her virginity on eBay, and yes, a man who eats a chicken after penetrating its dead carcass. What we found is that most moral violations are not funny. Only violations that people can see both as wrong and okay produce amusement. In other words, benign moral violations. For example, most people believe that having sex with a chicken is wrong because it violates a host of norms related to proper sexual conduct and sanitary behavior. However, a few of us are able to see this behavior as benign. For one, it's essentially harmless. After all, the chicken was already dead. Another reason this behavior can seem benign is that it is so unusual, particularly in the context of an academic journal article, that it doesn't seem real. Still, most people are not amused by this behavior. Many people don't see it as benign. This is especially true of people who are strongly committed to the idea that people shouldn't have sex with chickens. So we concluded based on our initial studies that moral violations are funny when they're benign. But we thought maybe we've actually come across a bigger idea. Maybe this idea of benign violations can explain an even wider range of humor. Maybe we're thinking about violation too narrowly. Perhaps violations aren't only things that threaten a moral norm, but anything that threatens a person's sense of how things should be. This includes physical threats, like getting kicked in the balls. Violations also include anything that threatens a person's identity, like an insult or foolish behavior. Violations include behaviors that part from social norms, like ingesting coffee through a body cavity other than your mouth. Violations include illogical behaviors, like a dog riding on a skateboard, and even violations of linguistic and communication norms, like a sarcastic welcome mat. This led to what we now call the benign violation theory. This theory argues that humor occurs when a violation, meaning anything that threatens your sense of how things should be, simultaneously seems okay, acceptable, sensible, or in other words, benign. So, people who only see something as wrong or threatening or bad don't experience humor. People who only see something as acceptable or normal or okay also don't experience humor. Humor only occurs for people who can see both of these interpretations at the same time. Let me return to some of these earlier examples. Most people think that churches shouldn't look like chickens. But if you don't happen to be a member of this particular congregation, you're probably okay with a picture that subtly mocks the building's architecture. Writing 500 pages on the history and social influence of a vegetable seems like a gigantic waste of time to most people. But as long as you don't actually have to read this book, this is probably a benign violation. Note that the author of this book probably doesn't think it's funny. For him, the potato is a perfectly worthy topic of intensive research. He doesn't see the violation. Puns can be benign violations, but only to people who care enough about language to feel some threat when a grammar or spelling mistake is made. In this case, the pun uses a spelling error. Qualifications is spelled incorrectly, but there's an alternative spelling that is correct according to the picture of the koala bear below. You can make the pun less funny by removing the violation. Here there's no spelling error. You can also make the pun less funny by including a violation, a misspelling, that isn't correct according to, doesn't make sense according to the picture below. So babies laugh too. Not at puns because they don't understand the language and the violations contained there, much less why they're benign, but they laugh at the game of peekaboo. Why is that? Unlike adults, babies haven't yet developed a sense of object permanence. This means that when an adult covers his or her face when playing peekaboo, the baby thinks that that person's gone. The baby feels abandoned, a violation. However, when the adult says peekaboo, shows the baby they're not actually gone, this violation becomes benign, and the baby laughs. One final example, and this one's given a lot of humor theories a lot of trouble, but the benign violation theory explains it pretty well, I think. Tickling is not a reflex. It only occurs in certain situations. It only produces laughter in certain situations, especially when you are attacked in a playful way by someone you trust isn't going to hurt you. In other words, when there's a benign physical attack, tickling often produces laughter. The same touch doesn't produce laughter if you try to tickle yourself. Here, there's no threat of an attack. There's no violation. Tickling also doesn't produce laughter if some creepy dude in a trench coat comes off the street and tries to tickle you. Here, there's a violation, but it's not benign. So the benign violation theory does a pretty good job explaining a lot of different types of humor. But a really good theory doesn't just explain things, it also predicts new ones. We've used the benign violation theory to make new predictions about how psychological distance influences humor perception. Psychological distance refers to the extent to which something feels close or far away in space, time, socially, or hypothetically. Several theories and a lot of people have suggested that distance increases humor. For example, people say too soon, meaning that if more time can pass, a joke might become more funny. Mel Brooks famously said, "Tragedy is when I cut my finger, comedy is when you walk into an open sewer and die." This implies that social distance can increase humor. What the benign violation theory suggests is that the effect of distance on humor is not that simple. It depends on how threatening or severe something is to begin with. Distance reduces threat. Therefore, distance increases the humor perceived in tragedies, like falling into an open sewer, by making the highly threatening violation seem more benign. This is why really terrible experiences often make for funny stories years later. On the other hand, distance actually reduces the humor perceived in minor mishaps, like almost falling into an open sewer, by completely removing the threat, by making it difficult to see the violation. This is why you often have to be there to appreciate the humor in more minor mishaps. Let me give you an example of how we tested this idea. So in a few of our studies, we showed experimental participants pictures. Some of these pictures showed severe violations, like this guy here. Other pictures involved more mild violations, like this guy with some ice on his beard. So in our experiments, we made pictures like these seem closer or farther away. What we found is that the severe violations were funnier when they appeared to be farther away. But the mild violations were funnier when they appeared to be closer. So let's return to one of my earlier examples. Jerry sending me Professor Bartolet's picture is a very mild violation. It's funnier to people who are closer to David and Jerry. On the other hand, Josh's porta potty diagram, or the event pictured here, shows a severe violation. This would be funnier if you're not especially close to the poor person inside the porta potty. A really good humor theory doesn't just explain humor. It doesn't just make predictions. It actually can make people funnier. Now, I would really love to tell you that we've given our humor theory to people and turned them into brilliant comedians, but I honestly don't have that evidence. What I do have is a fun experiment where my co-author Peter McGraw and a journalist Joel Warner mixed our theory, the benign violation theory, with some alcohol to see if it could make advertising people funnier. Specifically, what they did is they took the creative department at a very prestigious advertising agency to a bar, showed them the benign violation theory, and then asked them to create humorous Venn diagrams. So what the ad people had to do was put one idea in one circle, a second idea in the second circle, and their combination should create a humorous benign violation. At first, the ad men used relatively moderate violations to create humor. Oh, the one thing is, after they did this, they needed to finish their drink and do it again. So as they drank more, the violations became somewhat more severe, more humorous. But then the ad men kept drinking. And eventually they got totally hammered. And at this point, the violations they took it a little too far. The violations became so severe, they became difficult to see as benign. So what can we conclude from this ad men experiment and our other work? If you want to be funny, you need to do something that seems wrong, that parts from a norm in some way. But at the same time, you need to be careful not to take it too far, because your audience needs to see your behavior as benign. Therefore, it really helps to know your audience, especially their values and their belief system, because what seems like a benign violation to one person might seem just like a violation to a second person, or totally benign to a third. I do want to finish by thanking my collaborators and research assistants, especially the members of the Humor Research Lab, or as we call it, HURL, at the University of Colorado. So thank you all.